Imagine this. You're standing in the scorching sun, your hands blistered from relentless labour, while a sharp voice demands more from you than you think you can give. Now, ask yourself, could you have coped with the brutal reality of being a Roman slave? Would you have survived the backbreaking work, the dehumanisation and the constant struggle to hold on to your identity? In this video, we're diving deep into one of history's most harrowing experiences, life as a Roman slave. What was it really like to endure the daily grind of servitude in the ancient world? From the gruelling labour of the fields and mines to the psychological toll of being seen as property. I'll walk you through the day-to-day realities of their lives. But it's not just about survival. We'll explore how some slaves resisted their circumstances, carved out small freedoms and even found ways to change their fate. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll have a vivid understanding of their struggles and maybe even a new perspective on what it means to endure and overcome adversity. So, if you were ever transported back through time and popped up anywhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE as a Roman slave, you would most definitely have drawn the short straw, and this video will tell you why. Roman slave labour was integral to Roman society, with slaves performing a wide range of tasks from domestic duties all the way to mining and managing businesses. Urban slaves often worked as accountants or managers, while rural slaves took on agricultural and domestic roles. This accurately reflects the pervasive and essential role of slavery in the Roman world. It highlights the diverse functions slaves performed and distinguishes between their role in urban and rural settings. Slavery was not a peripheral element, but a cornerstone of the Roman economy and social structure. Slaves were not a small, marginalised group. They constituted a significant portion of the population, and their labour permeated nearly every facet of Roman life. This widespread reliance on slave labour had profound social, economic and political consequences. The range of tasks performed by slaves was remarkably broad, encompassing both menial and highly skilled occupations. This included domestic duties, agriculture, mining and quarrying, business and administration. The roles of slaves often differed based on their location. Urban slaves in cities were more likely to be employed in domestic service, skilled trades and administrative roles. Their skills in accounting, management and literacy made them valuable assets in urban businesses and households, whereas with slaves in rural areas, the vast majority were engaged in agricultural labour. While some also performed domestic duties in farmhouses and villas, their primary role was to work the land. Romans sourced their slaves from far and wide. They mainly came from conquered populations, piracy or theft. The number and quality of slaves were a status symbol for Romans, and as a consequence, Roman slavery was sustained through several key avenues. The first being conquered populations. This was the primary source of slaves. As the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire expanded through military conquest, vast numbers of people from conquered territories were enslaved. These individuals were forcibly removed from their homes and families and transported to Roman territories to be sold into slavery. Major military campaigns generated massive influxes of slaves, significantly impacting the demographics and economy of the Roman world. Piracy was another significant source of slaves. The Mediterranean Sea was plagued by piracy, and pirates frequently captured individuals from coastal settlements and ships. These captives were then sold into slavery in Roman markets. Another source of slaves, albeit less prevalent, was theft and kidnapping. Individuals could be seized from their homes or during travel and sold into slavery. The last source of slaves was by birth. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Roman slavery was the principle that children born to enslaved mothers automatically became slaves themselves, regardless of the father's status. This ensured a continuous supply of slaves across generations, perpetuating the system of slavery indefinitely. These home-born slaves often held a somewhat different status within the household, sometimes forming closer bonds with their owners. The ownership of slaves in Roman society was not merely an economic matter. It was deeply intertwined with the social status and prestige. Factors affecting these included the number of slaves, as the sheer number of slaves an individual owned was a direct indicator of their wealth and social standing. Wealthy Romans often owned hundreds or even thousands of slaves, using them to manage their large estates, businesses and households. The large retinue of slaves was a visible display of affluence and power. Another factor was the quality of slaves, in that the type and skill sets of slaves also contributed to their owner's status. Educated slaves such as tutors, scribes, physicians and accountants were highly valued and added to their owner's prestige. Owning skilled or educated slaves demonstrated not only wealth but also refined taste and cultural sophistication. Slaves were often sold in public markets, where potential buyers could inspect them much like livestock. This process was incredibly dehumanising, with slaves being stripped naked, examined for physical defects and sold to the highest bidder. The legal status of slaves as property was a defining characteristic of Roman slavery. This had significant implications for how slaves were treated and how they were viewed within Roman society. Roman law defined slaves as res mancipi, meaning they were considered property that could be bought, sold, leased or even bequeathed in wills. This legal status stripped slaves of all basic human rights and placed them entirely at the mercy of their owners. Because slaves were considered property, any damage or injury inflicted upon them was seen as damage to the owner's property. Roman law stipulated that individuals who harmed a slave were obligated to compensate the owner for the loss of their property's value. This principle reinforced the idea that slaves were not individuals with rights but rather commodities whose value could be assessed and compensated for in monetary terms. This included loss of work capacity, medical expenses and even the replacement value of the slave. This legal framework further dehumanised slaves, reducing them to mere economic assets. Roman slaves faced brutal punishments, including beatings, being held prisoner in chains, branding for escape attempts, and even execution. Daily life included limited rations and hard labour under harsh supervision. These accurately depict the harsh realities of slavery in ancient Rome. It highlights both the punitive measures used to maintain control and the oppressive conditions that characterised the daily lives of enslaved individuals. Roman law and social customs granted slave owners near absolute power over their slaves, including the right to inflict severe punishments. These punishments were not only meant to address specific transgressions, but also to serve as a deterrent to other slaves, ensuring obedience and preventing rebellion. The most common form of punishment was beatings. These were inflicted for a wide range of offences, from minor infractions to more serious transgressions. Slaves who were considered a flight risk or who had committed serious offences would usually be chained and or imprisoned. This served to restrict their movement and prevent escape attempts. Chains were a constant reminder of their enslaved status and the limitations placed upon their freedom. Branding was used to mark runaway slaves, making them easily identifiable if they were recaptured. The brand, often a letter F, was a permanent mark of shame and a warning to other slaves. It also served as a legal marker, making it easier for owners to reclaim their property. Finally, we have execution. In extreme cases, slaves could be executed for serious crimes such as theft, rebellion, or harming their owner. Crucifixion was a particularly brutal and public form of execution, often reserved for slaves, and was designed to instill fear and deter others from transgressions or future uprisings. This brings us neatly onto hard labour. This was performed in various sectors and subsequently led many slaves to be literally worked to death. This succinctly describes the brutal realities of Roman slavery, focusing on the gruelling conditions of forced labour and the commodification of enslaved individuals. The Roman economy relied heavily on slave labour, particularly in key sectors like agriculture, mining and construction. This demand for labour often translated into extreme exploitation and a complete disregard for the well-being of the enslaved. Some slaves were condemned to work in mines and quarries and endured some of the most horrific conditions. They toiled in dark, cramped and dangerous environments, extracting valuable minerals like gold, silver and iron, or quarrying stone for building projects. The work was physically exhausting, with long hours, poor ventilation and the ever-present risk of cave-ins and other accidents. These brutal conditions often led to exhaustion, injury, disease and ultimately premature death. The phrase "worked to death" is particularly apt in this context, as many slaves literally died from overwork and the harsh conditions they were forced to endure. Agriculture formed the backbone of the Roman economy, and vast numbers of slaves were employed in cultivating crops, tending livestock and working in vineyards and orchards. While the conditions in agriculture were generally less immediately lethal than in mines, the work was still incredibly demanding, involving long hours under the hot sun or in inclement weather. On large estates, hundreds of slaves were often overseen by harsh taskmasters who pushed them to their limits to maximise production. The construction of Roman infrastructure, including roads, aqueducts, public buildings and private residences, relied heavily on slave labour. This work was also physically demanding and often dangerous, involving heavy lifting, stone cutting and working at perilous heights. The combination of strenuous labour and hazardous conditions contributed to high rates of injury and mortality among enslaved construction workers. The basic diet of most Roman slaves was simple and often monotonous, consisting primarily of bread made from coarse grains like wheat or barley. This was the staple food for most slaves and it provided the bulk of their calorific intake. Diluted wine, known as posca, was a common beverage, providing hydration and some additional calories. It was often mixed with water or vinegar. Slaves also consumed an olive-based relish. This was a simple spread or relish made from olives, herbs, cheese and sometimes garlic. It provided some flavour and variety to the otherwise bland diet. These basic foods were often supplemented by food grown in gardens. Some slaves, particularly those on rural estates or in urban households with gardens, could supplement their rations with vegetables, fruits and herbs grown on small plots. Other sources of food that were available to some slaves were acquired by wild foraging. In rural areas, slaves might also forage for wild plants, fruits and nuts to add to their diet. However, access to these supplements were not uniform across all slave populations. A distinction existed between those working in harsh conditions such as mines or large agricultural estates and those in domestic service. Domestic slaves also had access to food left over from their masters. This food provided them with more varied and nutritious fare than the basic rations given to other slaves. This is a crucial distinction as it shows a difference in treatment and access to resources depending on the type of slavery. It is important to note that even for domestic slaves, food was often used as a means of control. Adequate nutrition was provided only to the extent necessary to maintain their ability to work. Furthermore, while domestic slaves might have had slightly better access to food, they were still subject to the whims of their owners and could face periods of deprivation or punishment. While rural slaves were often confined to estates or agricultural fields, urban slaves, particularly those in domestic service or with specialised skills, sometimes enjoyed a limited degree of freedom of movement within the city. This might involve running errands, delivering messages, or conducting business on behalf of their owners. This freedom, however, should not be mistaken for actual liberty. It was always conditional and subject to the owner's will. Despite this limited mobility, slaves remained under strict control. This control was maintained through several means. As property, slaves were subject to their owner's authority and could be punished for any perceived transgression. This legal framework served as a constant reminder of their lack of freedom. Even when physically away from their owners, slaves were aware of the social hierarchy and the potential consequences of disobedience. This social pressure acted as a form of self-regulation. The slave would constantly feel as though they were under surveillance, and they were. While of course this was not always direct and obvious, the possibility of being watched or reported by others served as a deterrent against escape or misbehaviour. Unlike some other slave societies where specific clothing or markings were used to identify slaves, in Roman cities there was no standard slave uniform. This lack of visual distinction meant that slaves blended into the urban population, making it difficult for outsiders to distinguish them from free people. This lack of clear visual distinction further complicated the social dynamics and added another layer to the control exerted over slaves. Slaves were often made to carry their wealthy masters around the city in sedan chairs. This was a common sight in Roman cities and served as a visual display of social status and power. It also highlights the subservient role of slaves and their use as a means of personal transport for their owners. Not all Roman slaves were destined for menial labour in fields or mines. Some were specifically trained as gladiators, professional fighters who entertained crowds in public arenas. These gladiators, while still legally slaves, occupied a unique position within Roman society. Many gladiators lived in cells equipped with heating and plumbing. This relatively comfortable living arrangement reflected their value as performers. Gladiators were expensive to acquire and train, representing a significant investment for their owners. providing them with decent living conditions ensured their health and well-being, maximising their performance potential. This is a crucial point. These comforts were not granted out of compassion, but rather out of economic self-interest. Gladiatorial training was rigorous and demanding, and was designed to prepare them for the brutal realities of arena combat. They were trained in various fighting styles and weapon types, and they underwent intense physical conditioning to enhance their strength, agility and endurance. This training was essential not only for their survival in the arena, but also for the quality of the spectacle they provided. Despite their specialised training and relatively comfortable living conditions, gladiators faced extreme danger in the arena. Their battles were often to the death, and they faced a variety of opponents, including other gladiators, condemned criminals fighting for their lives, and wild animals. These animal hunts were particularly dangerous, pitting gladiators against exotic creatures like lions, tigers, bears and bulls. This paradoxical existence highlights the complex and often brutal nature of Roman slavery. The conditions Roman slaves had to endure, particularly those working hard labour, often led to high mortality rates and fuelled resentment among the enslaved, creating fertile ground for rebellion. The most famous example of such a revolt is the Spartacus-led uprising that happened in 73 to 71 BCE. Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, led a large-scale slave rebellion that posed a serious threat to Roman authority. This revolt and others demonstrated the inherent instability of a society built on slavery and the potential for violent resistance from the enslaved. However, not all slave owners treated their slaves with cruelty. Many of the more enlightened slave owners recognised that treating their slaves well could increase productivity and reduce the risk of rebellion or escape. This pragmatic approach was based on economic self-interest rather than humanitarian concerns. Well-treated slaves were more likely to be loyal, productive and less likely to engage in disruptive behaviour. The use of promises of freedom as a motivational tool is another important aspect of Roman slavery. These promises, often of manumission, which was a formal release from slavery after a certain period of service or upon the completion of a specific task, served as a powerful incentive for slaves to work hard and remain obedient. This tactic allowed owners to extract more labour from their slaves while simultaneously offering a glimmer of hope for a better future. However, these promises were not always kept, and their use was primarily, in most cases, a means of control. Female slaves in ancient Rome were employed in a range of occupations, primarily within the domestic sphere and in certain specialised industries. A domestic servant was the most common role for an enslaved woman. They performed a wide array of household tasks, including cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, and serving as personal attendants to their mistresses. Their labour was essential for the functioning of Roman households, particularly those of wealthy families, where they often formed a significant part of the household staff. Some enslaved women possessed specialised skills such as weaving, spinning, embroidery and dressmaking. These skills were highly valued, and these women often worked in workshops or within wealthy households, producing textiles, clothing and other goods. Their skills contributed significantly to the Roman economy and the household economy of their owners. Factory work was less prevalent than domestic service or a skilled trade. Some enslaved women were also employed in workshops performing tasks related to food processing, pottery production or other industrial activities. This type of labour was often more physically demanding and less personal than domestic service. In some instances, particularly within domestic settings, relationships of trust and even affection could develop between enslaved women and their owners. This was more likely in cases where enslaved women had served a family for many years or who had developed close bonds with the children they cared for. However, even in these cases, the fundamental power imbalance remained. Unfortunately, many enslaved women endured harsh treatment, including physical beatings, verbal abuse and overwork. The lack of legal recourse meant that owners could inflict punishment with impunity, and there were few mechanisms to protect enslaved women from such abuse. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the treatment of enslaved women was their vulnerability to sexual exploitation by their owners and other members of the household. This abuse was a direct consequence of their status as property and their complete lack of agency. Sexual violence was a pervasive and often unspoken aspect of Roman slavery. Sadly, children fared no better as child slavery was prevalent in ancient Rome, with children facing harsh conditions and various forms of abuse. These children were often acquired through war, kidnapping or the sale of unwanted infants. Their duties varied depending on their owner's wealth and status. Some worked in agriculture, toiling in fields under gruelling conditions alongside adult slaves. Others were domestic servants performing tasks like cleaning, cooking and caring for their owner's children. Some were even forced into hazardous labour in mines or workshops. Abuse was rampant and took many forms. Physical abuse, including beatings and whippings, was common. Children were also vulnerable to sexual exploitation by their owners. Emotional abuse was also prevalent, with children being deprived of affection, subjected to constant humiliation and denied basic freedoms. The life of a child slave in ancient Rome was one of hardship, exploitation and suffering. While slavery was a pervasive institution in Roman society, it was not an entirely closed system. Freedom was attainable for some slaves through several avenues. Manumission was the most common method of gaining freedom. Manumission was the formal act by which a slave owner granted freedom to their slave. This could be done through a formal legal ceremony by declaration in front of witnesses or in a master's will. Some slaves, particularly those with skills who were allowed to manage their own small businesses, were able to accumulate enough money to purchase their freedom. This was a less common but still significant pathway to liberation. However, conditions for freed slaves were restrictive. Freed men, or liberti, did not enjoy the same rights and privileges as freeborn citizens. They faced certain social and legal limitations, including often being tied to their former owners through a system of patronage, owing them certain duties and obligations. This relationship could limit their autonomy and economic opportunities. Despite their legal freedom, freed men often faced social prejudice and were considered lower in social status than freeborn citizens. They generally did not have full political rights, such as holding public office. However, in all said and done, the possibility of freedom was entirely dependent on the individual slave owner. Some owners were more willing to free their slaves than others, while some slaves were subjected to such harsh conditions that the possibility of purchasing their freedom or being granted it was virtually non-existent. The lives of many slaves were marked by unrelenting hardship and a complete lack of hope for liberation. The end of Roman slavery was a slow and gradual process spanning several centuries rather than a single event. While it never fully disappeared, its prevalence in Roman society diminished significantly during the 3rd to the 7th centuries CE. Several factors contributed to this decline. The Roman economy underwent significant changes with a decline in large-scale agriculture and a rise in tenant farming. This reduced the demand for large numbers of slaves in agricultural labour. Another factor was due to the end of Roman expansion. This of course reduced the influx of new slaves captured through warfare. The rise of Christianity, while not directly abolishing slavery, promoted the freeing of slaves and influenced legal reforms that improved the status of slaves. By the 7th century CE, traditional Roman slavery had largely been replaced by other forms of labour, such as serfdom and tenant farming. These systems involved labourers who were bound to the land and owed obligations to the landowners, but they also had certain rights and protections that slaves did not. While slavery persisted in some forms and regions, it no longer held the central economic and social role it had in earlier Roman history. So there we have it. Life as a Roman slave was very dependent on which occupation and master or masters you ended up with. But either way, life would never have been easy. But before we give ourselves a pat on the back and say, thank God that doesn't exist anymore, think again. Because in one guise or another, slavery does exist for some poor unfortunates, irrespective of it being illegal or not. It is something we should all be on our guard against, no matter where we live. Well, thanks very much for watching yet another episode from History's Life Stories. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy these videos. Take care, and I will see you next time.